The morning sun cast long shadows across the Navy SEAL training compound as Dr. Sarah Chen stepped out of her sedan, medical bag in hand. The sound of her heels clicking against the concrete seemed unnaturally loud in the dawn silence. She had been called in for what appeared to be a routine medical evaluation of a new recruit who had sustained injuries during Hell Week training. Sarah had worked with military personnel for over 8 years, but this was her first assignment at a SEAL facility. The reputation of these elite warriors preceded them, men who could endure unimaginable pain and push through barriers that would break ordinary soldiers. She expected to encounter the usual bravado, the stoic silence that came with military conditioning. What she didn't expect was the scene that greeted her inside the medical bay. The injured SEAL, Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, sat on the examination table with his shirt removed, revealing a network of fresh cuts and bruises across his torso. But it wasn't his wounds that caught Sarah's attention. It was the way he held himself. His posture spoke of someone trying desperately to appear strong while fighting an internal battle that had nothing to do with physical pain. Doc Chen? Chief Petty Officer Williams approached her, his weathered face creased with concern. Thanks for coming in early. Rodriguez here took a pretty hard fall during the obstacle course yesterday. We need to make sure nothing's broken before we clear him for continued training. Sarah nodded professionally and set down her medical bag. As she began her examination, she noticed Rodriguez's breathing pattern, shallow and controlled but with the slightest tremor that suggested suppressed anxiety rather than pain. His eyes, when they met hers, held a depth of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. Can you tell me exactly what happened during the fall? Sarah asked gently, her hands expertly checking for signs of internal injury. Lost my footing on the rope climb, Rodriguez replied, his voice steady but lacking conviction. Hit the wall pretty hard on the way down. Chief Williams shifted uncomfortably. Actually, Doc, that's not exactly what happened. Rodriguez here. Well, he seemed to freeze up about halfway through the climb, just stopped moving for a good 30 seconds before he lost his grip. Sarah's hands paused in their examination. She looked into Rodriguez's eyes again, this time with the trained perception of someone who had seen trauma responses before. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. The way his jaw clenched when certain areas were touched, the slight flinch when she moved too quickly, the carefully controlled breathing. Rodriguez, she said softly, I need to ask you some questions that might seem unrelated to your physical injuries. Is that okay? The young SEAL nodded, but Sarah caught the flash of panic that crossed his features before he could mask it. Have you been experiencing any difficulty sleeping lately? Any nightmares or intrusive thoughts? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez's training had conditioned him to push through discomfort, to never show weakness, to be the unbreakable warrior that the SEAL reputation demanded. But Sarah saw the crack in his armor, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly before he clenched them into fists. I sleep fine. Doc, he said, but his voice carried the weight of a lie. Chief Williams frowned. Actually, his bunkmates have reported some restless nights. Talking in his sleep, that sort of thing. Sarah continued her examination, but her mind was working on a different level now. The physical injuries were minor. Some bruising, a few abrasions, nothing that would sideline a SEAL for more than a day or two. But the psychological indicators she was seeing suggested something far more serious. Rodriguez, I'm going to recommend that you be placed on limited duty for the next few days, she said, making notes in his file. Not because of your physical injuries, but because I think you might be dealing with something that needs attention. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Rodriguez straightened on the table, his face hardening into the mask of professional control that SEALs wore like armor. Doc, with all due respect, I'm fine. I don't need to be benched because of a few scratches. This isn't about the scratches, Sarah replied calmly. This is about the fact that you're showing signs of acute stress response. And continuing with high-intensity training while you're in this state could be dangerous. Not just for you, but for your team. Chief Williams looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. In his experience, SEALs didn't break. They bent, they adapted, they overcame. The idea that one of his men might be struggling with something that couldn't be solved through sheer willpower was difficult to accept. What kind of signs? Williams asked. Sarah chose her words carefully. Hypervigilance, controlled breathing patterns that suggest anxiety management, muscle tension that's inconsistent with the stated injuries, and what appears to be an avoidance response to certain stimuli. Rodriguez's control finally cracked slightly. "Look, Doc, I appreciate the concern, but you don't understand what we do here. We're trained to handle stress. We're trained to push through discomfort. That's the whole point." "I understand that," Sarah said gently. "But there's a difference between operational stress and trauma response, and what I'm seeing suggests the latter." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across Rodriguez's features. The warrior conditioning fighting against a deeper need for help that he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge. Finally, Chief Williams spoke. "Doc, what exactly are you recommending?" "I want Rodriguez to speak with someone, a counselor who specializes in military trauma, just to rule out any underlying issues that might affect his performance or safety." The suggestion hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. In the SEAL community, seeking psychological help was often seen as a career-ending move, a sign of weakness that could undermine not just individual careers but team cohesion. "Chief, I don't need a shrink," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "I need to get back to training. My team is counting on me." Sarah looked at both men, understanding the cultural and professional pressures at play. But her medical training and instincts told her that Rodriguez was carrying something heavy, something that would only get worse if left unaddressed. "Give me 3 days," she said finally. 3 days of limited duty, some time to talk through whatever's going on, and then we can reassess. If I'm wrong, you'll be back to full training by the end of the week." The compromise hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm between military culture and medical necessity. Rodriguez looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Sarah's expression, perhaps the genuine concern rather than professional obligation, gave him pause. What none of them realized was that this moment would become the catalyst for a revelation that would shake the entire SEAL community and force them to confront truths about trauma, service, and the hidden battles that even the strongest warriors sometimes fought alone. 3 days later, Sarah found herself in the base counseling office with Rodriguez, who sat across from her with the rigid posture of someone attending a mandatory briefing rather than a therapeutic session. She had convinced Chief Williams to allow her to conduct the initial assessment herself, knowing that Rodriguez might be more comfortable speaking with someone he had already met. The office was sterile and institutional, with motivational posters about teamwork and perseverance that seemed almost mocking given the current situation. Rodriguez stared at a point somewhere over Sarah's shoulder, his jaw set in the determined expression of someone preparing to endure rather than participate. "I know this isn't where you want to be," Sarah began, her voice gentle but direct. "And I know that in your training, admitting to psychological struggles probably feels like admitting defeat." Rodriguez's eyes flicked to hers briefly before returning to their fixed point. "Doc, I've been through Hell Week. I've completed BUDS training. I've passed every psychological evaluation the Navy has thrown at me. I think I can handle whatever's going on in my own head." "I don't doubt your mental toughness," Sarah replied, "but sometimes the strongest people carry the heaviest loads, and eventually, even the strongest backs need support." For the first time since she had met him, Rodriguez's composure wavered slightly. Something in her words had found its mark, touching on a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "What exactly do you think is wrong with me?" he asked. And Sarah caught the underlying fear in the question. "I think you're experiencing symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. The question is, what's the source of that trauma?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to affect me like this." Sarah leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "What wasn't supposed to affect you?" Another long pause. Then, as if the words were being pulled from some deep, carefully guarded place, Rodriguez began to speak. 6 months ago, before I started SEAL training, I was deployed with my Marine unit in Afghanistan, standard patrol mission in a village outside Kandahar. Intelligence said it was secure, just a routine check-in with local leadership. His breathing became more controlled, the way someone speaks when they're trying to maintain emotional distance from their own words. We were 3 clicks out from the village when our convoy hit an IED. The blast flipped our vehicle, killed our driver instantly. I was in the back with Corporal Jennifer Martinez, Jen. She was our medic and she was He paused, struggling with something. She was 19 years old, smart as hell, wanted to be a doctor when she got out, always talking about the medical school she was going to attend. Sarah noticed the way Rodriguez's hands had begun to shake slightly, and how his breathing was becoming more shallow. The IED blast trapped her under part of the vehicle. I could reach her, could see her, but I couldn't get her out. She was conscious, talking to me, trying to stay calm even though we both knew. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. What happened next? Sarah asked gently. Enemy fire started up. Sniper maybe 200 meters out. My team was pinned down and I was stuck there with Jen. She was bleeding internally. I could tell from the way she was breathing, the color of her skin. She knew it too. She was a medic. She understood what was happening to her body. Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to regain control. She kept talking to me about her plans, about medical school, about the clinic she wanted to run in her hometown, and I kept telling her she was going to be fine, that we were going to get her out, that she'd make a great doctor, but we both knew I was lying. Sarah remained silent, understanding that Rodriguez needed to tell this story at his own pace. The thing is, Doc, Jen didn't just die. She died trying to save me, even trapped under that vehicle, bleeding out. She was coaching me through treating my own injuries, telling me how to apply pressure to a shrapnel wound in my leg, how to position myself to avoid shock. She was dying and she was still being a medic. The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of his revelation. Sarah could see the guilt and pain that Rodriguez had been carrying, understanding now why the physical examination had triggered such a strong response. She died holding my hand. Rodriguez continued. Took her almost an hour, and the whole time she was more worried about me than herself. The last thing she said was to make sure I told her mom that she loved her. Did you? Sarah asked softly. Rodriguez nodded. Flew to Texas on my leave. Sat in her mother's living room and tried to explain how her daughter died a hero. But all I could think about was how I failed her. How I couldn't save her. How did you fail her, Rodriguez? The question seemed to surprise him. I was supposed to protect my team. I was supposed to get her out of there. You were trapped under enemy fire with limited mobility and no equipment. What could you have done differently? Rodriguez stared at her, and Sarah could see him grappling with a question he had never allowed himself to consider. I don't know, he admitted finally, but that doesn't change the fact that she's dead and I'm here. And now you're training to be a SEAL, Sarah observed. Why? Because I never want to be helpless like that again. I never want to watch someone die when I might have been able to save them. Sarah nodded, beginning to understand the complex web of guilt, determination, and trauma that had brought Rodriguez to this point. The freeze-up during the rope climb, she said. What triggered it? Rodriguez looked uncomfortable again. There was a moment halfway up when I looked down and saw the other trainees below me. For just a second, one of them, Lopez, he was looking up at me with this expression of trust. Like he was counting on me to make it, you know? And suddenly I was back in that convoy looking at Jen and I couldn't move. You're afraid of letting people down? Wouldn't you be? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think what you experienced was a trauma response, not a character flaw. And I think the reason it's surfacing now is because SEAL training is designed to push people to their absolute limits, physically and psychologically. Your mind is trying to process an unresolved trauma while you're under extreme stress. Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes, absorbing this perspective. So what does this mean for my training? He asked finally. It means we need to work through this before you can safely continue. Not because you're weak, but because unprocessed trauma can be unpredictable under stress. And in your line of work, unpredictability can get people killed. The brutal honesty of her assessment hit Rodriguez like a physical blow, but Sarah could see that it also carried a strange kind of relief. The relief of having someone finally name the thing he had been fighting alone. How long? He asked. That depends on you, Sarah replied. But Rodriguez, the fact that you're here, that you're willing to talk about this, that you want to continue serving despite what you've been through, that takes more courage than any physical training ever could. For the first time since she had met him, Rodriguez allowed himself to believe that maybe seeking help wasn't the same as giving up. Maybe it was just another kind of training, preparation for battles that couldn't be won with physical strength alone. Word spread quickly through the SEAL compound that Rodriguez was in counseling. In a community where mental toughness was valued above almost everything else, The news created ripples of discomfort and speculation. Sarah noticed the change immediately when she arrived for their second session. The way conversation stopped when she walked by, the sideways glances from instructors and trainees alike. Chief Williams pulled her aside before she could reach the counseling office. "Doc, I need to ask you something," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "How long is this going to take?" The other trainees are starting to ask questions, and frankly, some of the instructors are wondering if Rodriguez has what it takes to be a SEAL. Sarah felt a flash of frustration at the question, but she kept her voice level. "Chief, Rodriguez is dealing with combat trauma from his previous deployment. This isn't about whether he's tough enough. It's about making sure he's mentally prepared for the responsibilities you're training him for." "I get that, Doc, but the reality is that SEALs can't afford to have team members who might freeze up under pressure. We need to know that every man will perform when lives are on the line." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several SEAL trainees. Led by a stocky man with sergeant stripes whom Sarah recognized as David Morrison, one of the senior trainees in Rodriguez's class. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could sense the tension radiating from the group. "Excuse me, Doc," Morrison said. "We were wondering if we could ask you something about Rodriguez." Sarah glanced at Chief Williams, who nodded slightly. "What's your question?" she asked. "Is he coming back to training? Because if he's not, we need to know. We've been training as a team, and if one of our guys can't handle the pressure—" Morrison's words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Sarah could see the genuine concern in the faces of the men around her, but also the harder edge of pragmatism that came with their profession. "Rodriguez is working through some issues related to his previous combat experience," Sarah said carefully. "The goal is absolutely for him to return to training when he's ready." "What kind of issues?" asked another trainee, a lean man with the intense eyes of someone who had seen action. "Because if it's PTSD, maybe he should consider a different career path." The callousness of the comment stung, but Sarah recognized it for what it was: fear disguised as judgment. These men lived with the constant awareness that their lives might depend on the person next to them, and anything that threatened that trust was seen as a liability. "Let me ask you something," Sarah said, addressing the group. "How many of you have been in combat?" Several hands went up, though not all. "And how many of you have lost someone close to you in combat?" Fewer hands remained raised. But the ones that did belonged to men whose expressions had suddenly become more guarded. "The difference between those who've experienced loss and those who haven't isn't toughness," Sarah continued. "It's luck. Rodriguez isn't here because he's weak. He's here because he cares deeply about his responsibilities to his team, and he wants to make sure he can fulfill them effectively." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Look, Doc, no disrespect, but caring isn't enough. When the bullets start flying, you either perform or you don't. There's no middle ground." "You're absolutely right," Sarah agreed, surprising them, "which is exactly why Rodriguez is here. He wants to make sure that when the bullets start flying, his past experiences don't interfere with his ability to protect his team." The group exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. "Has anyone here ever had a moment during training where something triggered a memory?" Sarah asked. "Where your mind went somewhere else for just a second?" The silence that followed was telling. Sarah could see recognition in several faces, the acknowledgement of experiences they had never discussed. "The difference," Sarah continued, "is that Rodriguez was honest about it. He recognized what was happening and sought help. How many of you would have the courage to do the same?" Chief Williams stepped forward. "All right, that's enough. You men have training to get to. Morrison, get your squad to the obstacle course." As the group dispersed, Sarah caught the thoughtful expression on Morrison's face. Something in their conversation had clearly resonated with him. 20 minutes later, Sarah was in the counseling office with Rodriguez, who seemed more relaxed than he had during their first session. The simple act of talking about his experiences seemed to have lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. "How are you feeling about the reaction from your teammates?" Sarah asked. Rodriguez shrugged. "About what I expected. Nobody wants to be the weak link." "Do you think you're the weak link?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think I'm starting to understand that maybe being afraid of being the weak link was making me weaker." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Tell me about that." "Well, I've been thinking about what you said last time about how I was trying to process trauma while under extreme stress. And I realized that I've been carrying this guilt about Jen for 6 months, trying to pretend it didn't affect me, but it was affecting me. It was affecting every decision I made, every risk I took. How so? Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression becoming more animated as he worked through his thoughts. I've been so afraid of failing someone the way I felt like I failed Jen that I was second-guessing myself constantly. During training exercises, I was overthinking every move, trying to account for every possible outcome instead of trusting my training and instincts. And that's what led to the freeze-up on the rope climb? Exactly. I got halfway up and started thinking about all the ways I could fall, all the ways I could let my team down. Instead of just focusing on climbing the rope, Sarah made notes as Rodriguez spoke, impressed by his insight into his own psychological processes. There's something else, Rodriguez continued. I've been having the same nightmare for months. I'm back in that convoy with Jen, but this time it's different. This time I'm the medic and I can't remember any of my training. I'm trying to help her, but everything I do makes it worse. What do you think that dream represents? Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. I think it represents my fear that I'm not qualified to save people, that no matter how much training I get, when it really matters, I'll forget everything and someone will die because of me. And how does that fear affect your performance? It makes me hesitate. It makes me question decisions that should be automatic. And in SEAL training, hesitation gets you washed out. Sarah could see the breakthrough happening in real time. Rodriguez was finally connecting his past trauma to his current performance issues, understanding how unprocessed grief and guilt had been sabotaging his training. Rodriguez, what would Jen want for you? Sarah asked gently. The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Based on what you've told me about her, her dedication to helping people, her dreams of becoming a doctor, what do you think she would want for your future? Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away. She'd want me to keep going. She'd want me to use what happened to become better at protecting people. And do you think she'd want you to carry guilt about something that was beyond your control? No, he whispered. She'd probably tell me to stop being an idiot and get back to training. Despite the emotional weight of the conversation, both Sarah and Rodriguez smiled at that. So what does that mean for you going forward? Sarah asked. Rodriguez straightened his shoulders, and Sarah could see some of the old determination returning to his posture. It means I need to stop trying to carry her death as punishment and start carrying her memory as motivation. It means I need to trust my training instead of second-guessing myself. And it means I need to get back out there and prove that her sacrifice meant something. Sarah felt a surge of professional satisfaction. Rodriguez was making real progress, developing the psychological tools he would need not just to complete SEAL training, but to serve effectively without being crippled by his past. Are you ready to talk to Chief Williams about returning to training? She asked. Rodriguez nodded firmly. I'm ready. What neither of them realized was that their conversation had been overheard by Morrison, who had been passing by the office and paused when he heard Rodriguez's voice. The senior trainee's expression was thoughtful as he walked away, Rodriguez's words about using trauma as motivation rather than punishment echoing in his mind. Rodriguez's return to training was met with a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. Chief Williams had agreed to let him rejoin his class on a probationary basis, with the understanding that any signs of psychological instability would result in immediate removal from the program. Sarah continued to meet with him twice weekly, monitoring his progress and helping him develop coping strategies for the intense stress of SEAL training. The first few days went smoothly. Rodriguez seemed more focused and confident than he had before his counseling sessions, tackling obstacles with a renewed sense of purpose. His teammates watched him carefully, looking for signs of weakness or hesitation, but he performed consistently and without incident. It was during a night navigation exercise that everything changed. The training scenario was designed to simulate a high-stress reconnaissance mission. Teams of 4 were dropped in unfamiliar terrain with minimal equipment and tasked with reaching specific coordinates while avoiding detection by opposing forces played by instructors. Rodriguez was paired with Morrison, Lopez, and a newer trainee named Thompson who had joined the class recently. The exercise began at 2200 hours under a moonless sky that made navigation particularly challenging. Rodriguez felt confident as his team moved through the wooded terrain, using the techniques they had drilled countless times. His mind was clear and focused, free from the second-guessing that had plagued him before his counseling sessions. They had been moving for about 2 hours when Morrison suddenly raised his hand, signaling the team to stop. In the distance, they could hear voices. The opposing force was nearby, probably setting up an ambush along their planned route. "We need to circle around," Morrison whispered. "Take the long way to avoid contact." Rodriguez nodded, but as they began to move, Thompson stumbled over a hidden route and went down hard. The sound of his fall seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest, and immediately they heard shouts from the opposing force as they realized there were trainees in the area. "Thompson's hurt," Lopez whispered urgently. "I think he twisted his ankle pretty bad." Rodriguez moved to Thompson's side and quickly assessed the injury. It wasn't serious, but Thompson would have difficulty moving quickly or quietly. In a real-world scenario, this was exactly the kind of situation that could compromise a mission and endanger lives. Morrison's voice was tense as he evaluated their options. "We can't carry him and maintain stealth, and we can't leave him here." The opposing forces were getting closer, their flashlight beams sweeping through the trees as they searched for the source of the noise. Rodriguez could feel his heart rate increasing, but not from fear or panic, from the clarity of purpose that came with a crisis situation. "I've got an idea," Rodriguez said. "Give me a radio." Morrison hesitated. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that sometimes the best way to complete a mission is to create a distraction. I'll draw them off, give you guys time to get Thompson to the extraction point." "Rodriguez, that's not the mission parameters," Morrison argued. "We're supposed to reach the coordinates as a team." "The mission parameters just changed when Thompson got injured," Rodriguez replied calmly. "In the real world, you adapt to circumstances." Lopez looked between them, understanding the tactical logic but also recognizing the personal risk Rodriguez was proposing to take. "How do we know you're not going to freeze up out there?" Morrison asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rodriguez met Morrison's gaze directly. "Because I'm not the same person who froze on that rope climb," he said. "I know what I'm carrying now and I know how to use it." Before anyone could argue further, Rodriguez activated the radio and began moving away from the group, deliberately making noise to attract the attention of the opposing forces. His voice carried clearly through the forest as he called out false coordinates and diversionary information, making it sound like his entire team was moving in the opposite direction. The strategy worked. The opposing forces took the bait and began pursuing Rodriguez, allowing Morrison's reduced team to move Thompson toward the extraction point. Rodriguez led his pursuers on a challenging chase through the dense woods, using every stealth and evasion technique he had learned. What his teammates didn't realize was that Rodriguez was experiencing something he hadn't felt since before Jen's death: the complete confidence that came from knowing exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. There was no second-guessing, no paralysis of analysis. Just clear, decisive action based on training and instinct. The chase continued for over an hour. Rodriguez managed to evade capture, while successfully drawing the opposing forces away from his teammates' route. When the exercise finally ended at dawn, the instructors were impressed by the tactical creativity and selfless teamwork he had demonstrated. "Chief," Williams approached Rodriguez as the teams gathered for debriefing. "That was some quick thinking out there," Williams said. "How did you know the distraction would work?" Rodriguez considered the question. "I didn't know for certain, but I knew that doing something was better than doing nothing, and I trusted my team to take advantage of the opportunity." "And you weren't concerned about being captured?" "Of course I was concerned, but I was more concerned about leaving a teammate behind." Williams nodded approvingly, but Rodriguez could see that the chief was evaluating more than just his tactical performance. He was assessing Rodriguez's mental state, looking for signs that the pressure had triggered any psychological issues. "How are you feeling about the whole thing?" Williams asked. Rodriguez smiled slightly. "I feel like myself again, Chief, maybe for the first time in months." The debriefing session that followed was unlike any Rodriguez had experienced during his training. Instead of focusing solely on tactical performance, the instructors spent considerable time discussing the psychological aspects of decision-making under stress. Rodriguez found himself being asked to explain his thought process, to describe how he had maintained focus and confidence during the high-pressure situation. Morrison approached him afterward, his expression thoughtful. "I owe you an apology," Morrison said. "When you first went to counseling, I thought you were looking for an easy way out. I didn't understand that you were actually doing the harder thing. What do you mean? Rodriguez asked. I mean facing whatever was messing with your head instead of just trying to push through it. That took guts. Rodriguez appreciated the acknowledgement, but he could see that Morrison was wrestling with something deeper. You okay, Morrison? Morrison was quiet for a moment, then spoke in a voice that carried uncharacteristic vulnerability. Can I ask you something? How did you know when you needed help? The question revealed more than Morrison probably intended. Rodriguez recognized the same internal struggle he had faced, the conflict between military conditioning and the recognition that some battles couldn't be won through willpower alone. I knew because I was working harder than ever but performing worse than usual, Rodriguez replied. And because I was afraid all the time, not of getting hurt but of letting people down. Morrison nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds familiar. You want to talk about it? Morrison glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. Maybe, but not here. Rodriguez understood. The SEAL community was small and tight-knit, and admitting to psychological struggle still carried significant professional risks. But the conversation planted a seed that would grow in the days to come. As the teams dispersed to prepare for the next phase of training, Sarah arrived for her scheduled check-in with Rodriguez. She could see immediately that something had changed. His posture was more confident, his expression more relaxed. Good morning, she said. I heard you had an interesting night. Rodriguez grinned. You could say that. Chief Williams said I showed tactical initiative and selfless teamwork. I think that's military speak for you didn't screw up. How did it feel? It felt like I remembered who I was before everything happened with Jen. But also like I'm someone new. Someone who's learned from what happened instead of being crippled by it. Sarah made notes as he spoke, pleased with the progress he was demonstrating. There's something else, Rodriguez continued. I think Morrison might be dealing with some of the same issues I was. He asked me about how I knew I needed help. Sarah's professional interest was immediately engaged. What did you tell him? The truth, that it took more courage to admit I needed help than it did to try to handle it alone. Sarah nodded approvingly. Rodriguez was not only healing from his own trauma, but potentially becoming a bridge for others who might be struggling in silence. It was exactly the kind of outcome she had hoped for when she first recommended counseling. 2 weeks after the night navigation exercise, Morrison approached Sarah directly. She was leaving the medical building after a routine consultation when she noticed him standing near her car, his posture suggesting someone who had been waiting for a while but was having second thoughts about the conversation he wanted to have. Sergeant Morrison, Sarah acknowledged as she approached. Were you looking for me? Morrison straightened slightly, falling back on military formality as a way to manage his discomfort. Yes, ma'am. I was wondering if I could speak with you about something. Privately. Sarah unlocked her car and set her briefcase inside, giving Morrison a moment to collect his thoughts. Of course. Would you prefer to go to my office, or would you like to talk here? Here's fine, Morrison said quickly. I don't need an official appointment or anything. Sarah leaned against her car, adopting a casual posture that she hoped would put Morrison at ease. What's on your mind? Morrison was quiet for several moments, his jaw working as he struggled with words that clearly didn't come easily. Rodriguez told me something a couple weeks ago. He began finally. About how he knew he needed help, and I've been thinking about it ever since. What specifically has been on your mind? Morrison glanced around, confirming they were alone before continuing. I've been having dreams. Bad ones. And I can't shake the feeling that I'm losing my edge. Sarah recognized the careful way Morrison was presenting his concerns, minimizing them while simultaneously reaching out for help. It was a delicate balance between maintaining his professional image and acknowledging his need for support. How long have you been having these dreams? She asked. About 4 months, since we finished our last deployment. Can you tell me about them? Morrison's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as he wrestled with the decision to be vulnerable. We lost someone on that deployment, he said finally. A good kid named Patterson. He was green, maybe 21 years old, full of enthusiasm about serving his country. Reminded me of myself when I first joined up. Sarah waited, understanding that Morrison needed to tell this story in his own way. We were doing a night raid on a suspected weapons cache. Intelligence said the building was empty except for the target. Patterson was point man. His choice, he volunteered. Said he wanted to prove himself. Morrison's voice became more strained as he continued. The building was rigged. As soon as Patterson stepped through the door, the whole front wall came down. IED hidden in the door frame. He was crushed instantly. I'm sorry, Sarah said gently. That must have been traumatic for your entire team. The thing is, Doc, I should have seen it coming. I should have recognized the signs that the building was booby-trapped. I've got 8 years of experience, and Patterson had 8 months. But I let him go first because he asked to, because I wanted to encourage his initiative. Sarah could see the guilt that Morrison was carrying, the weight of command decisions that had resulted in tragedy. What do the dreams involve? She asked. Different scenarios, but they all end the same way. I'm leading a team, making decisions, and someone gets killed because I missed something obvious. Sometimes it's Patterson. Sometimes it's other guys from my unit. Sometimes it's trainees from this class. And you said you feel like you're losing your edge? Morrison nodded. I'm second-guessing myself constantly now. During training exercises, I find myself checking and rechecking everything, looking for threats that probably aren't there. It's like I don't trust my own judgment anymore. Sarah recognized the pattern immediately, the same hypervigilance and decision paralysis that Rodriguez had experienced, manifesting differently but stemming from similar trauma. Morrison, what you're describing sounds like a normal response to losing someone under your command. The guilt, the dreams, the hypervigilance, these are all common reactions to that kind of trauma. Morrison's expression hardened slightly. Doc, I've lost people before. This is part of the job. I can't afford to fall apart every time something goes wrong. You're not falling apart, Sarah replied firmly. You're processing a traumatic experience. And the fact that you're here talking about it shows that you're handling it better than you think. Rodriguez said something similar. That seeking help was harder than trying to handle it alone. What do you think about that? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. I think he might be right. Standing here talking to you about this is one of the hardest things I've done in years. Why? Because SEALs aren't supposed to break. We're supposed to be the ones other people can count on when everything goes to hell. If I can't trust my own judgment, how can I ask other people to trust it? Sarah understood the core of Morrison's struggle, the conflict between his professional identity and his human need to process trauma. Can I ask you something? She said. If one of your teammates came to you with the same concerns you're sharing with me, what would you tell them? Morrison considered the question. I'd tell them that recognizing a problem is the first step to solving it. I'd tell them that good leaders get help when they need it. And why would that advice be good for them but not for you? The question hung in the air as Morrison grappled with the contradiction in his thinking. I guess because I hold myself to a different standard, he admitted. A higher standard? Yeah. Morrison, what if that higher standard is actually making you a less effective leader? The suggestion clearly caught Morrison off guard. What do you mean? I mean that your hypervigilance and self-doubt are probably affecting your decision-making and your ability to trust your team. The very thing you're trying to prevent, putting people at risk, might be more likely to happen if you don't address these issues. Morrison absorbed this perspective, his expression showing the internal struggle between ingrained military thinking and practical reality. So what do you recommend? He asked finally. I recommend that we set up some regular sessions to work through these issues, not because you're broken, but because you're a leader who wants to be as effective as possible for his team. Morrison nodded slowly. How long would something like that take? That depends on you and how much work you're willing to put into it. But Morrison, the goal isn't to make you forget what happened to Patterson or to eliminate all emotional responses to trauma. The goal is to help you process these experiences in a way that makes you a better leader, rather than a more anxious one. And this stays between us? Absolutely. Patient confidentiality applies to military personnel just like everyone else. Morrison extended his hand to Sarah. All right, Doc. Let's give it a try. As they shook hands, Sarah felt a sense of professional satisfaction mixed with concern. Morrison's willingness to seek help was encouraging, but she was beginning to realize that trauma-related issues might be more common among special operations personnel than the military establishment was willing to acknowledge. "Morrison," she said as he turned to leave, "can I ask you something? In your experience, how many of your teammates have dealt with similar issues?" Morrison paused, considering the question carefully. "More than you'd think, Doc. But most of them handle it the way I was handling it, by trying to push through it and hoping it goes away." "And does it usually go away?" Morrison's expression was grim. "Not usually. Sometimes guys just burn out and leave. Sometimes they develop drinking problems or other issues. And sometimes—" He trailed off. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes they make mistakes that get people killed, and then they carry that guilt on top of everything else." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the full implications of what Morrison was telling her. The military culture that discouraged seeking help for psychological issues wasn't just harming individual service members, it was potentially creating a cycle where untreated trauma led to poor judgment, which led to more trauma. "Morrison, would you be willing to help me understand this problem better? Not just for your own treatment, but to help other people who might be struggling with similar issues?" Morrison looked at her with new interest. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet. But I think there might be more people who need help than are currently getting it. And I think it might take people like you and Rodriguez, people who've been through it and come out the other side, to help them understand that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I could do that. If it helps other guys avoid going through what I've been dealing with, count me in." As Morrison walked away, Sarah remained by her car, processing their conversation and beginning to formulate an idea that would challenge the very foundations of how the military handled psychological trauma among its elite units. Sarah's meeting with Commander Jackson was scheduled for 800 hours, but she arrived at his office 30 minutes early to review her notes one final time. The proposal she was about to present could either revolutionize how the Navy dealt with psychological trauma among special operations personnel, or it could end her career working with military units. Over the past month, word had spread quietly through the SEAL community about Rodriguez and Morrison's positive experiences with counseling. 3 more trainees had approached Sarah directly, and she had begun to suspect that the problem was much larger than anyone in command wanted to acknowledge. Commander Jackson's office reflected his 30 years of military service, walls covered with commendations, unit photos, and mementos from deployments around the world. When Sarah was finally called in, she found Jackson reviewing her preliminary report with the focused attention of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected lives. "Dr. Chen," Jackson said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, "I've read your report and I have to say some of your recommendations are pretty unconventional." Sarah had expected this reaction. "Commander, I believe the conventional approach isn't adequately addressing the scope of the problem. Walk me through your thinking." Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a set of statistics she had compiled. "In the past 6 weeks, I've worked with 5 different SEAL trainees dealing with trauma-related issues. Based on my conversations with them, I estimate that at least 30% of your current class has experienced some form of combat-related psychological trauma that is affecting their performance." Jackson's eyebrows rose. 30%? That seems high. "Sir, these are men who have been deployed in combat zones often multiple times before entering SEAL training. They've seen friends killed, they've been in life-threatening situations, and they've made split-second decisions under extreme pressure. The idea that they would emerge from those experiences without any psychological impact is unrealistic, but they passed all the standard psychological evaluations. The standard evaluations are designed to screen out severe mental illness and obvious instability. They're not designed to identify functional trauma responses or early-stage PTSD symptoms." Jackson leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "What exactly are you proposing?" Sarah took a deep breath before presenting her most controversial recommendation. "I'm proposing that we implement mandatory psychological counseling as part of SEAL training, not as a response to problems but as a preventive measure Just like physical conditioning and medical checkups, the silence that followed was heavy with implications. Jackson's expression was unreadable, but Sarah could sense his internal struggle between operational effectiveness and institutional resistance to change. Dr. Chen, you're talking about fundamentally changing how we approach mental health in special operations. The cultural implications alone, sir, the cultural implications of continuing to ignore this problem could be far worse. How many missions have been compromised by personnel who were struggling with unaddressed trauma? How many preventable mistakes have been made by operators who were afraid to seek help? Jackson was quiet for several moments, and Sarah could see him weighing her words against his own experiences and observations. You mentioned that several trainees have come forward voluntarily. How are they performing now? Rodriguez completed his training last week and has been selected for advanced placement. Morrison is showing significant improvement and is on track to graduate with his class. The others are making steady progress. And their teammates' reactions? Initially skeptical, but increasingly supportive. Word is spreading that seeking help actually improves performance rather than compromising it. Jackson stood and walked to his window, looking out at the training grounds where the next generation of SEALs was being forged. Dr. Chen, what you're proposing would require approval from levels far above my command. And frankly, I'm not sure the brass is ready for this kind of change. Sir, what if we started with a pilot program, a voluntary counseling program that's presented as performance enhancement, rather than mental health treatment? Jackson turned back to face her, his interest clearly piqued. Explain. We frame it as psychological conditioning, teaching operators how to process stress, manage traumatic memories, and maintain peak performance under extreme pressure. We make it part of their tactical training rather than separate from it. And you think that would be more acceptable to both command and the operators themselves? I think it removes the stigma while providing the same essential services. We're not treating mental illness, we're optimizing mental performance. Jackson sat back down, his expression thoughtful. That's actually not a bad approach. How would you structure something like that? Sarah felt a surge of excitement as she realized Jackson was seriously considering her proposal. Small group sessions integrated into the training schedule. Focus on stress management, decision-making under pressure, processing difficult experiences, and team communication. We use the same men who've already been through counseling as peer mentors. Rodriguez and Morrison, among others. Men who can speak from experience about how addressing psychological issues improved their performance, rather than hindered it. Jackson made notes as Sarah spoke, his military mind already working through the logistics and potential obstacles. What about resistance from the instructors? Many of them come from the old school of thinking that mental toughness means never admitting to psychological struggles. We include them in the training, show them how to recognize signs of trauma-related performance issues, and how to direct personnel to appropriate resources. Make them part of the solution rather than obstacles to it. And if command rejects the proposal? Sarah had anticipated this question. Then we continue working with individuals who seek help on their own, and we document everything. Eventually, the performance improvements will speak for themselves. Jackson was quiet for several minutes, reviewing Sarah's notes and considering the implications of what she was proposing. Dr. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. What you're suggesting goes against decades of military culture. There are going to be people who see this as coddling, as making our warriors soft. Sir, with respect, ignoring psychological trauma doesn't make warriors stronger. It makes them more fragile. The strongest steel is forged through controlled heating and cooling, not by pretending it can withstand infinite stress without treatment. Jackson smiled slightly at the metaphor. That's a good way to put it. All right, Dr. Chen, I'm willing to put together a proposal for a pilot program, but I want Rodriguez and Morrison involved from the beginning. If we're going to sell this to command, we need operators speaking for it, not just medical personnel. They've already agreed to help. Sir? Good. Give me 2 weeks to put together a presentation for the Admiral. And Dr. Chen? Yes, sir? I hope you're right about this. Because if you are, you might be saving a lot of careers and possibly a lot of lives. As Sarah left Jackson's office, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The pilot program she had proposed could change how the military approached psychological health among its most elite units. But it could also face fierce resistance from an institution that had spent generations equating emotional vulnerability with weakness. Her thoughts were interrupted by Rodriguez, who was waiting for her in the hallway. Doc, how did it go? Sarah smiled. He's going to propose a pilot program. And he wants you and Morrison to be part of the presentation. Rodriguez's face lit up with excitement. Really, we get to help sell this thing? If you're willing, it's going to require you to talk openly about your experiences, possibly in front of senior command. Rodriguez's expression grew serious, but determined. Doc, if talking about what happened to me helps other guys avoid going through what I went through, then I'm all in. Even if it means potentially facing criticism from people who think seeking help is a sign of weakness? Especially then, Rodriguez replied firmly, because I know now that the real weakness would have been continuing to struggle alone when help was available. As they walked together toward the training compound, Sarah felt a cautious optimism about the future. Change was never easy, especially in institutions as tradition-bound as the military. But with advocates like Rodriguez and Morrison willing to speak from experience, and commanders like Jackson willing to listen, maybe it was possible to create a culture where seeking help was seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness. The real test would come when they faced the broader military establishment and tried to convince career officers that the strongest warriors were those who had learned to heal from their battles, not just survive them. 6 months later, Admiral Rebecca Harrison sat in the Pentagon briefing room, reviewing the preliminary results of what had become known as the Warrior Resilience Program. The numbers before her challenged everything she thought she knew about psychological conditioning in Special Operations Forces. Commander Jackson stood at the front of the room alongside Dr. Sarah Chen, Rodriguez, and Morrison. Behind them, a large screen displayed performance metrics that told a compelling story of transformation. Admiral, Jackson began, the results of our pilot program have exceeded all expectations. We've seen a 28% improvement in training completion rates, a 45% reduction in stress-related injuries, and most significantly, a 60% improvement in team cohesion scores. Admiral Harrison studied the data carefully. As one of the few female flag officers in the Navy, she had learned to scrutinize unconventional proposals with particular attention to their practical implications. Commander Jackson, these numbers are impressive, but I need to understand the methodology. How exactly did you implement this program without compromising the rigor of SEAL training? Dr. Chen stepped forward. Admiral, we integrated psychological conditioning into existing training modules rather than adding separate counseling sessions. Operators learned stress management techniques alongside tactical skills, and they practiced processing difficult scenarios in controlled environments before encountering them in the field. And the operators themselves? How did they respond to what many would consider a fundamental change in military culture? Rodriguez and Morrison exchanged glances before Rodriguez stepped forward. Admiral, permission to speak candidly? Granted. Ma'am, at first we were skeptical. Most of us saw psychological counseling as something that would end our careers. But what we learned was that addressing trauma and stress made us better operators, not weaker ones. Morrison added, the program taught us that mental conditioning is just as important as physical conditioning. We wouldn't send someone into combat without proper physical training, so why would we send them without proper psychological preparation? Admiral Harrison leaned back in her chair, processing their words. Give me a specific example of how this training improved operational effectiveness. Rodriguez and Morrison looked at each other, and Morrison nodded for Rodriguez to continue. During a recent training exercise simulating a hostage rescue, my team encountered an unexpected scenario that triggered traumatic memories for one of our teammates. Instead of freezing up or making a rash decision, he was able to use techniques from the program to manage his stress response and communicate effectively with the team. We completed the mission successfully instead of having to abort. And before this program, that operator probably would have struggled in silence, made a mistake that compromised the mission, and potentially left the program believing he wasn't cut out for special operations. Admiral Harrison made notes as Rodriguez spoke, clearly impressed by the practical applications he was describing. Dr. Chen, what's been the response from other military psychologists and medical personnel? Initially skeptical but increasingly supportive as word spreads about our results. We've had requests from Army Special Forces, Air Force Pararescue, and Marine Force Recon to implement similar programs in their units. And from the operators' families? Sarah smiled. Overwhelmingly positive. Spouses report that their partners are better able to transition between deployment and home life, and they're more willing to discuss work-related stress rather than bottling it up. Admiral Harrison turned her attention to Commander Jackson. What's been the biggest challenge in implementing this program? Resistance from traditional instructors who view psychological counseling as incompatible with warrior ethos. We've had to work hard to reframe the program as tactical training rather than therapy. And how have you addressed that resistance? Morrison stepped forward. Admiral, we've found that having operators who've been through the program speak to skeptical instructors is the most effective approach. When they hear from someone who's actually experienced combat trauma and can explain how the program made them more effective, it's harder to dismiss. Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly. That's sound strategy. Using credible messengers to overcome institutional resistance. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Pentagon courtyard where service members from all branches moved with the purposeful efficiency that characterized military life. Gentlemen, Dr. Chen, what you've accomplished here represents more than just improved training metrics. You've challenged a fundamental assumption about how we prepare our most elite warriors for the psychological realities of combat. She turned back to face the group. The question now is whether this approach can be scaled across special operations forces without losing its effectiveness. Dr. Chen had anticipated this question. Admiral, we've developed a training program for instructors and medical personnel that can be implemented at other facilities. The key is maintaining the integration of psychological conditioning with tactical training and ensuring that operators who've successfully completed the program are available as peer mentors. What about cost? Commander Jackson provided the financial analysis. The program actually reduces costs in the long term by decreasing attrition rates and reducing the need for remedial training. The investment in psychological conditioning pays for itself through improved retention and performance. Admiral Harrison returned to her seat and reviewed her notes one final time. I'm prepared to authorize expansion of this program to 3 additional SEAL training facilities with evaluation after 1 year, but I want regular reports on performance metrics, operator feedback, and any challenges encountered during implementation. The room was silent for a moment as the implications of her decision sank in. Rodriguez felt a surge of emotion as he realized that his willingness to seek help had potentially changed the trajectory of military mental health treatment. Admiral, he said, permission to add something? Go ahead. Ma'am, when I first froze up during training and Dr. Chen recommended counseling, I thought my career was over. I thought admitting I needed help meant I wasn't strong enough to be a SEAL. What I learned was that real strength comes from facing your demons and learning from them, not from pretending they don't exist. Morrison nodded in agreement. The program didn't make us soft, Admiral. It made us smarter. It gave us tools to deal with stress and trauma that made us more effective in every aspect of our jobs. Admiral Harrison smiled slightly. Gentlemen, that's exactly the kind of warrior resilience we need in our special operations forces. Dr. Chen, congratulations. Your pilot program is now official Navy policy for SEAL training. As the meeting concluded and participants began filing out, Rodriguez caught Dr. Chen in the hallway. Doc, I need to tell you something. Yesterday I got a letter from Jennifer Martinez's mother, the medic who died in Afghanistan. Sarah's expression grew serious. How did she know to contact you? I've been writing to her regularly since I started the program, telling her how I was working through what happened to her daughter. She said something in her letter that I think you should hear. Rodriguez pulled out a folded piece of paper and read aloud. Marcus, knowing that Jennifer's death has motivated you to help other service members deal with trauma and stress would make her incredibly proud. She always believed that the best way to honor the fallen was to use their sacrifice to make the living stronger. Thank you for proving her right. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full circle that Rodriguez's journey had completed. Rodriguez, how does that make you feel? It makes me feel like maybe I finally understand what Jen would have wanted. Not for me to carry guilt about her death, but to use what I learned from losing her to help other people. She was always trying to save people. Now I get to continue that mission in a different way. As they walked together toward the exit, Sarah reflected on how a single moment of frozen terror on a rope climb had led to a transformation in how the military approached psychological resilience. Sometimes, she thought, the greatest breakthroughs came not from strength, but from the courage to admit vulnerability and seek help. The Warrior Resilience Program would go on to be implemented across all Special Operations Forces, fundamentally changing how elite military units prepared their personnel for the psychological demands of combat. But for Sarah, Rodriguez, and Morrison, the real victory was knowing that future warriors would never have to face their battles, external or internal, alone. In the end, they had learned that true military strength came not from the absence of trauma, but from the wisdom to heal from it and the courage to help others do the same. The strongest warriors were not those who never fell, but those who learned how to get back up and taught others to do the same.